In this lecture, I plan to deal with how Alexander the Great secured the political legacy left by his father, Philip of Macedon. And between 336 and 335 BC, Alexander waged a remarkable set of campaigns and pursued some very fancy diplomacy to bring the Balkan regions as well as the Greek city-states under his control. This was an extraordinary achievement by the young king. At the time of his father's death, he was either 20 or perhaps 21 years of age. And the sudden death of Philip, ordinarily, at least in previous Macedonian history, should have signaled civil wars, challenges from various pretenders. There were several men who could have challenged Alexander for the throne of Macedon, and certainly was a potential signal to the Greek city-states to repudiate the League of Corinth, not to elect Alexander as the new commander-in-chief, Stratikos Autokrator, and essentially to return to their independence before the settlements of Philip back in 337 BC. The fact that this did not happen, that the kingdom did not fragment, that Alexander managed to secure the kingdom quickly, as well as bring the Balkan peoples under control, and to have himself elected head of the commander of the Hellenic League, is a testimony to not only Philip's work. I mean, Philip had created this new kingdom with its institutions, but also the precocious genius of Alexander himself. In 336 BC, soon after his father's assassination, Alexander really did confront a crisis, and it's difficult for us to appreciate how much the Macedonian monarchy was still very largely personal. The army would follow a king who had the charisma and the ability to win victories which proved the favor of the gods, and Alexander had to do this in order to make his rule stick with the Macedonians. This included the nobility, who formed the companion cavalry, the elite hypaspes, that is the guard of the king, as well as the various taxes, or regiments of the phalanx, which represented various regions of the greater Macedonian kingdom. Furthermore, Alexander had to make his rule stick with the various subject peoples in the Balkans. To the north, different Illyrian tribes. To the east, the various Thracians. His mother could return from exile in Epirus, and there was no danger there because his uncle Alexander of Epirus was an ally, and he knew he could count on the Epirot king. That was about the only ally that was secure to him. To the south, he had to collect all of the titles and positions that Philip had gathered in running the Greek League. Notably, he had to be elected head of the Thessalian League. He had to make his will known to the Greek city-states so that the Synhedrion would elect him the commander of the Greek forces. This was a tall order. And Antipater, who is in effect Alexander's senior advisor at the time, advised caution that Alexander should secure the kingdom, perhaps beat up some Thracians, but take it slowly, because there would be no way that this young king could succeed to the splendid heritage of his father, which had taken over 20 years for Philip to build. Well, Alexander did not take this advice. He, from the start, knew that destiny was on his side, that he had the ability to win victories. And a remarkable aspect about Alexander's generalship is we don't see in his career, and we have a pretty good account of his campaigns from Arrian and the other sources, we don't see in Alexander an evolution in generalship, the way we do with some commanders. I think of someone like Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose first victory was actually won by his generals because Fritz was driven off the battlefield by his opponents. Alexander, from the start, seemed to be able to wage sieges, small wars, that is, guerrilla operations, set-piece battles, hard-marching campaigns. To be sure, he had inherited a superb army from his father, but he achieved victories and deeds with that army that I don't think Philip ever had in his wildest dreams. And so he had supreme confidence in his ability to master the battlefield, to impose his will on the battlefield by understanding the terrain and the intentions of his opponents and then countering it. And he really was truly an exceptional commander. And at age 20, 21, he already had these abilities. There were some executions. There were some political, to us it would seem very nasty, but this is probably typical politics at the Macedonian court. Two brothers were arrested. They were members of the Lancastrian house, that is one of the royal families of Western Macedon. Their names are Attalus and Amyntas. They're well known. They are kept in custody until 330 BC. Attalus, the uncle of Philip's last wife, of course, was suspect. He was recalled from Asia, later implicated in a plot and executed. And finally, there was Alexander's first cousin, named Amyntas, again, a very common name in Macedon. He had been married to one of the daughters of Philip by the Illyrian princess, and he was arrested on grounds of complicity and executed. The two executions, one on treason, both of them on treason, but one of them was a potential heir. The other was the uncle of the rival queen, Cleopatra. She was done away with, apparently, by Olympias. But that was it. There was no major purge. And those historians who attempt to see Alexander as murdering his father and then clearing Macedon of all these people have really overstated the case. Many of the generals who would serve with Alexander in the first 4 years of the Asian expedition were his father's generals. Above all, Parmenio, who proved to be the second in command, an able and very loyal second in command in the Asian expedition. And Alexander, just as his father, was quite pragmatic. His job was to inspire his nobles and get the best out of them. And those people arrested and executed were either actually involved in the plot or clearly were much too close to the throne that they would be potential threats. Well, that left Alexander two areas to bring under control. There was no question that the Macedonians acclaimed him king immediately. The first is the Balkan regions. These were areas that had been brought into the greater Macedonian kingdom during Philip's reign. These people were non-Greek, non-Macedonians. They were reputed to be excellent warlike races. They loved the Thracians. Thracians were marvelous light infantry. They were very, very tall by Greek standards, probably stood, 5'10", with flaming red hair and would scare anyone off the battlefield. There were also mountain peoples, such as the Agrianians, excellent javelin men. They became one of Alexander's favorite units in Asia. They were light-armed skirmishing forces. They were everywhere with Alexander. There were Illyrian and Thracian horsemen. So the military potential of these regions was important. 25% of the army taken to Asia came from these Balkan peoples. Furthermore, there was a distant frontier, the lower Danube, which was known to Alexander. His thoughts were to push the frontier to the Danube, to secure that northern and northwestern frontier from barbarian peoples, because he planned to depart to Asia, and it was necessary to impress these peoples with the majesty of the Macedonian king, the son of Philip Philip II. Sorry, getting a little excited there about Phil's career. Then there was the matter of the Greeks. I think the best way to handle this problem is to first look at the Balkan peoples and then look at the Greeks in this 2-year period. In the winter of 336-335 BC, Alexander received reports that the tribes in the Balkans were restive. There were a danger of major rebellions in Thrace and among the Illyrians. And the Thracians occupied the region between the Rhodope Mountains today, which would be known as the Hymus Mountains to the ancients. That's the great mountain range that essentially bisects Bulgaria today, east-west, and the North Aegean shore. The Illyrians were in the regions to the west and the northwest of Upper Macedon. Both of these peoples had cause to make common alliance. They had traditionally raided Macedonian borders whenever a Macedonian king had died, and none of the various princes or rulers among these tribal peoples were really rather eager to accept Alexander as their lord. They had been beaten into submission by Philip, and this was now the signal to become independent. Early in 335 BC, Alexander decided to target the Thracians first. It was easier to get to them. The military highways were there. And he, however, planned not only to chastise the Thracians, but as soon as he had done that, to turn around and defeat the Illyrians. This was very ambitious. In looking at his father's career, Philip never waged a campaign against Thracians and Illyrians in the same season. They were always separate campaigns. Alexander does them both in a single year, in the year 335. The army marched along the various military highways to the city of Philippopolis, which is the Macedonian colony in Thrace, and then pressed north, and the speed of his advance essentially stunned many of the Thracian tribes into submission. One king named Sirmis of the Tribalians, which is a sub-branch of the Thracian peoples, and he dwelled in the mountain zones and the northern slopes of the Rhodope or Hymus Mountains stretching to the Danube. He refused submission, and he occupied the passes of the Hymus range, and probably at the modern pass of the Shipka Pass, He prepared to oppose Alexander, and what he did is what's typical in this type of mountain warfare. The various Tribalians had assembled, and they loaded up these carts with huge amounts of boulders, and they were going to roll these carts down on the Macedonian army and then attack. You know, it sounds like something out of the northwest frontier from India and Lord Robert's march from Kandahar to Kabul. Alexander saw this immediately. He ordered his infantry to form up in what is known as a testudo. That is a tortoise formation. It comes from the Roman word, where they locked their shields, and they advanced and positioned themselves so that as the carts came down, apparently they rolled and bounced off this wall of shields and harmlessly fell into the pass. And Alexander immediately attacked with his light-armed infantry and archers and drove off King Sirmus and his Tribalians. They took refuge in fortresses in the Danube. Alexander crossed into the Tribalian homeland and began to torch the area. Various tribes again came and submitted to Alexander. It was a matter of time before he would secure all the submissions, because he was attacking at the time when the grain was harvested. He did, however, confront a threat from across the Danube, and this was from various nomadic peoples known as Getae, distant relatives of the later Dacians. And they rode up along the northern shores of the Danube and made demonstrations, jeering at Alexander's army and challenging him to cross and take them over. Alexander decided to make an example of them. He didn't really need to do so. But what he did is he took a strike force of some 4,000 men, including infantry and cavalry. They stuffed their tents and various leather containers with straw and crossed the Danube by swimming across on these improvised vests, almost, leather vests filled with air and straw, and took up a position in a wheat field. So the next day, when the Getic cavalry came riding down to the riverbank and insulted the Macedonian army, they were greeted by artillery fire on the far bank by the Macedonian army, which prepared to cross. And on signal, Alexander's army popped up out of this wheat field and attacked the Getae in the rear. He probably was outnumbered, but Alexander understood that audacity, stealth, surprise could win victories. The Getae were essentially chased off. They were chastised. The impression apparently had its effect. That is, the northern frontier was never again threatened by these people during Alexander's reign or even far after Alexander's death. The defeat of these nomadic peoples, who were potential allies to the Thracians, essentially demoralized the remaining Thracians. King Sirmus himself of the Tribalians surrendered shortly afterwards, and Thrace was secured probably in a matter of a couple of months. It was an extraordinary campaign of marching and largely stealth and surprise with very little fighting. Nonetheless, the impression had been made, and Alexander was free to move against the Illyrians. The Illyrian tribes had concentrated to the west of Macedon at a town called Pelion. We're not quite sure of its location. And Alexander approached this town at rapid speed, forced march, with an army of about 25,000 men. From what we gain from the descriptions, Pelion was in a plain that was ringed by mountains, and Alexander's army came in and drove the main Illyrian force into this fortress. It was commanded by actually a grandson of King Bardylus, who was the old opponent of his father Philip of Macedon, and his name was Clitus, and there was a relief force of Illyrians coming under another prince called Glaucius. It looked as if Alexander had mistimed his advance, because he drove Clitus and the main Illyrian force into the fortress, put it under siege, and then the relieving Illyrian forces, or the reinforcements, arrived under Glaucius, and they seized the heights, and particularly the pass, the crucial pass that led east to Macedon, which was the line of supply for Alexander. So it looked as if Alexander's army was trapped. It would be difficult to take the fortress. The Illyrians occupying the high points could cut off supplies, and the Illyrians were really quite self-satisfied about this. Well, Alexander again used a remarkable ruse to get his army out of this predicament, and what he did is he set up a parade in which the Macedonian army performed all sorts of complicated maneuvers, marching around in front of the city of Pelion. And the Illyrians, both on the walls and the mountains, were absolutely dazed by this. They came down stunned, looking at what was going on. The Macedonian army could do things that, these Illyrians couldn't even begin to do. And what he did over the course of several hours is he turned these Illyrians from opponents into spectators. And they came down from the mountain apparently to get a good look at this parade and all this armor and the cavalry and the bodyguard. And they performed different maneuvers in this way and that way. And then he positioned his forces in such a way that he ordered them to charge. And they came barreling at these Illyrians, who at first are looking at what's happening? They're actually coming at us, and they scattered and ran away, and Alexander took his army out of the pass, regrouped, and returned several days later and clobbered these guys and defeated them, and the Illyrians submitted. It was a brilliant ruse. It's typical of the type of stealth and audacity that characterizes Alexander, and it's these types of tactics, the surprise of the nomadic cavalry on the banks of the Danube, the clever ruse to take the city of Pelion, or at least to get yourself out of a predicament. These sort of tactics will appear again when Alexander is fighting in Central Asia and in India, where he has to fight these types of wars of pacification. As I said, he already shows at age 20, 21, well, at this point he would be 21 years of age, he shows an extraordinary ability to turn any situation into his advantage. Now, in disappearing in these regions of Illyria and Thrace, it took him out of the limelight of the Greek world. And no sooner had he finished chastising the Illyrians at Pelion, probably sometime in August of 335 BC, he received news that the city of Thebes had rebelled and that the Greek city-states were moving to put together another general coalition, thank you Demosthenes, to oppose the Macedonian overlordship. So with the Balkans secure, let's turn to the Greeks next. Now that requires us to back up a bit chronologically. The revolt that broke out at Thebes in August of 335 BC was fed by a rumor that Alexander had been killed fighting the Illyrians. And the rebellion of the Thebans was by no means to be unexpected, because from the very start, when Philip was killed sometime in late summer or fall of 336 BC, the Greeks had not wanted to accept Alexander as their commander-in-chief. So let's pick up the story on the Greeks and what had happened there. The news received by the various Greek city-states that Philip was dead caused celebration, at least among the great city-states. As I said, many lesser cities probably saw Philip as their protector. In Athens, for instance, Demosthenes, who had just lost one of his daughters to a premature death, held sacrifices to Zeus and to Liberty, threw his house open to an enormous party, and celebrated that the monster was dead, and really took no note of Alexander. He saw this as the beginning of eleutheria, freedom, and autonomy again. There were also dissidents in Thebes. The Spartans, no doubt, were eager to challenge the Macedonian allies in the Peloponnesus. And above all, the Thessalians, who were vital for their cavalry forces, refused to elect Alexander as the head of their league. And if Alexander could not be elected Tagos, or commander of the Thessalian League, which Philip had held since 352 BC, well, he really couldn't command any of the Greeks. Alexander, therefore, in the autumn of 336 BC, that is about 6 months before he waged his Balkan campaigns against the Illyrians and Thracians, moved south to assert himself in the Greek world. The Thessalians had occupied the key passes near Mount Olympus, and there are 3 of them that allow access from Macedon into Thessaly. Alexander circumvented those blockading forces by sending out his engineers and cutting steps in a track, which is still visible today, apparently, can be traced in some parts, around Mount Olympus. And he sent a force at night around the Thessalian forces in the passes, and in the next morning, when the Macedonians appeared in the rear, the Thessalians reconsidered their options and decided that maybe it was a good idea to elect Alexander the commander of their league. So without actually any fighting, the Thessalians were immediately brought in line, and this was important. Thessalian cavalry was almost as good as Macedonian. They were the best cavalry in Greece. They fought as heavy cavalry, comparable to the Macedonians as lancers, and it was important to have this force with them. They always served on the left wing of the Macedonian army, and they were really very essential for those types of battles of encirclement. Alexander pressed south through the pass at Thermopylae. He moved so quickly that he took most of the Greeks by surprise. Demosthenes was embarrassed. He decided it might be a good idea to check out of Athens for a while. The Thebans were overawed. The Thebans had been talking of rebellion, but as soon as Alexander appeared, that was it. No one would move against the Macedonian army. The memories of Chaeronea were too vivid. Alexander then made his way to Corinth and visited the city of Corinth, probably for the only time in his life, as far as we know. At Corinth, he summoned the Sanhedrion, that is the great federal council, and they unanimously elected him the commander-in-chief of the Hellenic League, that is strategos autokrator, the position that his father had held. So in the late autumn of 336 BC, Alexander had put himself at the head of all these Greek city-states and announced his intention to carry out the Asian expedition of his father. This is extraordinary. Antipater, Parmenio, all the senior commanders back in Pella would have told Alexander not to attempt this. Nonetheless, legally, Alexander was now heir to the political legacy that Philip had built up in Greece. There are a couple of anecdotes that are very telling about Alexander at this time. They come from Plutarch. One of them is that while Alexander was in the city of Corinth, he happened upon Diogenes, who is a Cynic philosopher. And the Cynic philosophers were those who essentially renounced worldly goods and sought to find fulfillment in oneself. Diogenes, there's a lot of anecdotes associated with him. He's the man who is remembered for walking around with the lit oil lamps, seeking an honest man. Actually, attempting to do that in Corinth is really quite hopeless. Corinth, as the major port town of the Greek world, was notorious for its decadence, as you would expect. And in St. Paul, if I remember, there's a verb called korinthizomai, which means to behave like a Corinthian, that is, to be depraved. So you can understand what that city was like. In any event, Alexander wants to meet this famous philosopher. He goes to Diogenes, and Diogenes is living in some slum area of Corinth, and the story is he's living in a barrel or some type of some makeshift residence, and he presents himself, I am Alexander the Great, the son of Philip. Well, I am Alexander, the son of Philip, not quite yet great. And what can I do for you? You know, as the head of the Greek League. Diogenes is totally unimpressed and said, well, young man, could you move a little to the right because you're blocking the sun? I want to sun myself. So Alexander obliges him, and Diogenes is quite self-satisfied, and Alexander makes the remark, well, if I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes, which is the greatest compliment Alexander could give to this philosopher who had renounced the world. The other anecdote was apparently a visit to Delphi, and it would be at this time, and that would be important because, given his position as head of the Thessalian League, he controls the religious council that governs Delphi, which is without a doubt the most important shrine in the Greek world, and he gets the Pythia to sit on her stool to give an oracle. He wants her to tell him something about his success, and she's really very reluctant to do this. And eventually Alexander is ready to pull her off her seat, and she says, "You are invincible, Aniketos." And Alexander takes that as a portent, well, I will conquer the Asian world. Most of the Greeks would have had opportunity, at least the major Greek political figures, to see this young king in 336 BC. They would see him again in the next year. They must have already seen the difference between the young king and the father. Philip acted quite differently towards his Greek allies. He was much more sensitive to their notions of autonomy and freedom. Alexander was full of confidence. He was just stunning in how fast he moved that army, but there was clearly a difference. This was a crown prince who did not understand the politics and dynamics of running Greek city-states. And over the course of the next 10 or 11 years, the tensions between Alexander and his Greek allies would mount. And in the end, it would be the Greek allies who would be the most difficult subjects of Alexander to run, and would ultimately, I think, in some ways do in the Macedonian Empire. That is, the unity of the Macedonian Empire in the Wars of the Successors. For the moment, Alexander returned to Macedon for the winter of 336-335 BC, and then took off to defeat the Balkan peoples. I mentioned by going on to campaign against Illyrians and Thracians, this was a very audacious move, and the impression Alexander had made among the Greeks the previous autumn was quickly lost. Rumors circulated that Alexander had been killed fighting the Illyrians. Witnesses were produced who gave wonderful stories on what had happened to the young king, and there's a lot of speculation of who was behind this. In any event, Alexander, who had just finished defeating the Illyrians at Pelion, received news that Thebes had rebelled. The Macedonian garrison on the Cadmea was under siege, that the Athenians were moving to form an alliance, that the Spartans might mobilize an army in the Peloponnesus to take back their old allies. All of this information came to him. At an unbelievably record march, and it's still difficult to understand the distances involved because it's hard to figure out the precise distances of where was Pelion located, but within a period of 10 days, he had marched his army from somewhere in a rather remote place in Illyria to the suburbs of Thebes. The advance was so stunning that initially the Thebans couldn't believe it was Alexander, the son of Philip. Alexander promptly put the city under siege. The Thebans fought as best they could, but the Macedonian army was able to break into the city very rapidly. There was a sortie by the Theban army, that is an attack from the city on the Macedonian armies, and the Macedonian phalangates, that is the men of the phalanx, drove it back, particularly the battalion or the regiment, if you will, of Perdiccas, later to distinguish himself in Asia, and they pursued the Thebans into the city and actually burst into the city. Many of the lesser Greek city-states, the Thespians, Plataeans, the Phocians, actually turned out to join the Macedonians in the sack of the city, and Alexander spared no one. The city was brutally sacked. It was apparently leveled to the ground. The only building not damaged was the house of the poet Pindar. After all, Alexander was brought up on Greek literature, and you really shouldn't destroy those sort of things. Otherwise, the city he made an example of it. 30,000 Thebans were captured, they were enslaved, they were sold off immediately, and the city was essentially left desolate. Later in life, when Alexander was in Central Asia, he regretted this, or he claims to have regretted it. He did promote certain Theban mercenary officers, he allowed the city to be rebuilt, and he also attributed one of his rash actions, that is essentially the manslaughter, the killing in a drunken rage of Clytus, one of his commanders in 328 BC, to the ire of Dionysus, who was the protective god of Thebes. And Alexander had offended Dionysus because in the sack the temples had been destroyed. It was also put out that the Sanhedrin had voted the destruction. We're not sure how that would have been done. One argument is that those Greek city-states that were sending contingents and fighting at Thebes cooperated with Alexander's Macedonians, and then they essentially held an impromptu meeting and voted the punishment of Thebes. But whatever the legal niceties, it had its effect. After the sack of Thebes, most Greek city-states realized that if they dare cross this king, there would be consequences. And the message was well learned. Now, there will be an attempt by the Spartans to raise a rebellion against Alexander when he's in Asia, but on the whole, the lesson was well learned. It also was a lesson, however, that never really reconciled the Greeks to Alexander. To them, the sack of Thebes was an act of Macedonian barbarism. There were various stories circulated on how unpopular Alexander was while he was in Asia, and one of the most favorite stories that would be told is that in the army of the great king, there were more Greeks fighting than in the army of Alexander, who represented the Pan-Hellenic cause. And that is because many Greek soldiers, mercenaries, officers, including generals from Athens, took service in the Persian army. And after all, the Macedonians aren't Greeks, and so they don't count, and he's got all these Balkan peoples, and the number of Greeks really in Alexander's army was, rather small for especially a Pan-Hellenic army. But it underscores the fact that Alexander had gained the acceptance by the Greeks. Whether he had won their loyalty was another story. And we will see as the story unfolds that the Greeks do seize the opportunity to rebel after Alexander's death. Nonetheless, in the summer of 335 BC, Alexander had secured his inheritance. He had control of the Balkan regions, the Kingdom of Macedon, all of the Greek League, and he was now prepared to invade the Persian Empire. And never was there a more audacious act in history.